We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Kazakhstan, October the 4th, 1957. A Soviet Vostok rocket thrusts its way through the clouds towards Earth orbit. There it delivered Sputnik, a tiny man-made satellite, and the age of space was born. A Soviet triumph that amazed the world and stunned the Americans. 2 months later came a Sputnik 6 times as heavy, with a passenger, a dog named Laika. America responded with a Flopnik, a humiliating launch disaster that had them in search of a new designer. They chose Werner von Braun, the man behind Germany's wartime V-rockets. With the missile he'd already developed for the United States Army, von Braun had an American satellite in space within 3 months. But Soviet technology was ahead. Its genius, Sergei Korolev, whose brainchild was Sputnik. The space race was on, and Korolev was producing heavier vehicles, more powerful boosters. In 1959, he actually shot this craft as far as the moon, where it crash-landed. And later that year, another first. Till then, man had seen only the near side of the moon. Korolev was to unveil the far side. By looping behind the moon to photograph its hidden face, a robot craft radioed the pictures back to base. They revealed a face quite different to the one we see from Earth. Meanwhile, the Americans announced Project Mercury. With this capsule, they planned to put a man in space. The first mission would be a 15-minute hop. A Redstone rocket would carry the capsule out of the atmosphere, then detach. After re-entry, the capsule would parachute to splashdown. That was the plan, and one of these 7 should have been that first man in space, closely followed by missions that would use a more powerful Atlas rocket to push capsule and astronaut into orbit. The Soviets also planned a man in space aboard this top-secret Vostok craft. The cosmonaut would ride inside a ball-shaped capsule. It was 1961, height of the Cold War. In terms of space, capitalist technology versus communist technology. To get the first man in space would be a tremendous propaganda victory. So, amid great security, the Soviets hand-picked their candidates from the armed services. And they tested them to breaking point. The man to emerge was Air Force Lieutenant Yuri Gagarin. His launch rocket was well proven, but there were problems with the small propulsion unit Gagarin must use in space. Once, when test-fired by remote control, the capsule spun away into orbit instead of slowing down for re-entry. Rather worrying. Nevertheless, a date was fixed for blastoff, and the gigantic Vostok launcher relentlessly assembled. All this unsuspected by the Soviet people, the outside world, and of course the Americans. Gagarin himself seemed untroubled, but at the launch site, preparations were reaching fever pitch. The Americans had already announced their first manned space hop would be in May. The Soviets were determined to beat them. Thus, on April the 12th, 1961, test pilot Yuri Gagarin was about to attempt man's first journey into space. If he failed, the world might never know, for the strictest media blackout prevailed. Bon voyage from mission chief Sergei Korolev, and Gagarin was on his way. This indeed was history. For the first time, man was escaping the atmosphere to make a single orbit of Earth. Yuri Gagarin was in space, and the Soviets could tell the world. 33 engines had carried the Vostok aloft. Then, their fuel spent, the 4 strap-on boosters were jettisoned. Next to go was the protective nose cone, which freed the space vehicle to blast into orbit. Re-entry was achieved by firing retro rockets. The craft slowed, dispensed with its propulsion unit, and began the descent, controlled by parachute. Gagarin, it said, landed in the spacecraft. Subsequent cosmonauts ejected. "23 days later, utterly upstaged, the Americans launched their first spaceman. A puny Redstone rocket lobbed Alan Shepard into a 15-minute suborbital hop. Stung by the Soviet lead, President Kennedy announced that America would have a man on the moon before the decade was out. The Soviets responded with a space woman. Valentina Tereshkova shot into orbit in June of 1963. By now, though, the Americans too were seasoned orbiters. This was the last splashdown of the Mercury missions, which had begun with Alan Shepard. Uncle Sam's astronauts were ready to chase the Soviets. They would do it in Gemini, a larger craft than Mercury, and scheduled for the world's first 2-man mission in 1965. Not to be outdone, the Soviets jumped in ahead and launched 3 men in a capsule designed for 1. There they are, so cramped they flew without spacesuits or ejector seats. A few months later, just days ahead of the first 2-man Gemini, Alexei Leonov became the first cosmonaut to walk in space. The Soviets had done it again. But with the launch of the Gemini missions, America was to shrug off Soviet triumphs and concentrate on one thing: getting a man to the moon. This meant testing equipment, training astronauts, rendezvousing, and docking in orbit. Lots could go wrong, like the angry alligator nose cone of this docking probe, which failed to open. Later missions were to rendezvous with other Gemini craft and to dock with a Gina rocket specially fired into orbit for the purpose. All this was vital. Rendezvous and docking would be the keys to a successful lunar mission. Gemini 4, the second 2-man mission, was the Americans' first spacewalk, a useful foretaste for working in the minimal gravity of the moon. An astronaut's view as Gemini leaves orbit to return to Earth. The flashes are searing heat generated by the friction of the atmosphere against the spacecraft. The Gemini program ended in 1966. It had been the bridge between the tentative steps of Mercury and the great adventure of Apollo. (1967), Cape Kennedy, Florida. Project Apollo, a $24 billion program designed to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. A presidential decree. The Americans, for years outstripped by the Soviets, had a new confidence, but not for long. These astronauts, Virgil Grissom, Ed White and Roger Chaffee, died in a horrifying flash fire training in their module on the launch pad. The moon seemed to belong to the Soviets. Their lunar spacecraft had been the first to crash land there in 1959. Luna 3 was first to loop behind the moon and photograph its hidden face. A robot in 1966 had been the first to soft land. And a Soviet craft was the first to achieve a proper moon orbit. But the Americans had their successes too. Before crashing, Ranger probes like this sent back some brilliant pictures of the lunar terrain. And later craft, surveyors, were to soft land and place instruments on the surface. Their pictures showed the moon could indeed support a manned landing craft. So, heartened by this intelligence, America dispatched its lunar orbiters. They were to photograph the moon as never before, to select landing sites for men. Meanwhile, the Soviets had developed Soyuz, a three-part spacecraft. Although it couldn't land them there, Soyuz had the capacity to take 2 men round the moon and back. But tragedy marred its first mission. As the command module re-entered Earth's atmosphere, its parachutes failed to open. There was nothing Mission Control could do. Trapped inside without an ejection seat, cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov plunged like a stone to his death. Within 3 months, both the Americans and the Soviets had suffered severe setbacks. "18 months later, on October the 11th, 1968, a Saturn 1B rocket lifted off on the first manned Apollo mission, Apollo 7. In low Earth orbit, it practiced rendezvousing with the spent upper stage of the launcher. Apollo proved a safe and successful vehicle for her crew, the first American trio in space. The race for the moon was hotting up. The Soviets lobbed an unmanned Zond right round the moon and splashed it down in the Indian Ocean. Then they did it again, but with a difference. The Zond, a modified Soyuz, made a double-dip return, skipping off the upper atmosphere in the southern hemisphere and drifting down in Central Asia. Everyone expected their next mission to be a manned lunar flyby, but it never happened. Instead, in late December, America's Apollo 8 left Earth for the moon. By Christmas Eve, astronauts Borman, Lovell and Anders had hurtled through 400,000 kilometers of space and locked into a lunar orbit. For the first time, man was flying above another world, and the Soviets sent congratulations. But the race was not yet won. Apollo 8 was a circumlunar expedition, not a landing. After some 20 hours in moon orbit, she departed this lifeless landscape. Apollo, with her Saturn rocket, was 110 meters high. Only her top section was destined for the moon. The lunar landing craft, the in-space propulsion unit, and the command module. The nose would be dumped. But of all Apollo, just the tiny command module would return to Earth. March the 3rd, 1969, and Apollo 9 tested a manned lunar landing craft in Earth orbit. Nicknamed Spider, it passed with flying colors, maneuvering and rendezvousing perfectly with the mothership. Every system was proved. Even the suits to be worn on the moon were tried out in spacewalks. May the 18th, and Apollo 10 does a dummy run to the moon. The landing module sweeps halfway towards the touchdown point chosen for the next mission. It goes like clockwork. Astronauts Stafford, Young and Cernan do everything except make history. That they must leave to Apollo 11. The national objective had been set 8 years earlier, to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. The decade had just 5 months to run. Apollo 11 was on her way. First and second rocket stages jettisoned, Earth orbit achieved. Then the burn for the moon, realignment of the lunar modules, and the dumping of the third stage rocket. 3 days out, a touch on the retros and lunar orbit. The two Apollo modules began to separate. Everything had gone as rehearsed, but this was the real thing. The world held its breath. Apollo's command module, Columbia, was to remain in orbit. The lander module, Eagle, was to make the actual touchdown. Inside were astronauts Armstrong and Aldrin, dropping into the unknown. But the surface was bumpier than expected. Armstrong had to take manual control. A flurry of dust, and a perfect touchdown. Eagle had landed. July the 20th, 1969. As Neil Armstrong clambered cautiously down the ladder, mission control was spellbound. The United States had done it, and over the next 3 years there were to be 5 more Apollo landings. In typical American fashion, it was no time before the arrival of moon buggy. As Darwin's voyage of the Beagle had changed the course of biological sciences, so Apollo began to reshape planetary and Earth sciences. Much of the astronauts' work involved the collection of geological samples. In the process, they developed the lunar hop. Moon gravity is 1/6 of that on Earth, so it was an easy way to get around in their cumbersome suits. Kilo upon kilo of dust and rock was carted back for analysis. Some samples gave valuable clues to the formation of the planets. What did emerge was that the moon never formed part of the Earth. They discovered that water and oxygen could be produced from the lunar soil. Given the will, permanent self-supporting moon bases should be no problem, even if one pioneer found it difficult to keep his feet. And so, for home. Without a hitch, the lander cleared the surface, in the case of Apollo 11 with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin aboard. They were to reconnect with Michael Collins, still orbiting overhead in the command module Columbia. Their trajectory and rendezvous were perfect. Having safely delivered them to Columbia, the lander was jettisoned and the reunited Apollo crew were able to blast out of lunar orbit for home. It was some 60 hours before they slipped into Earth orbit and prepared for re-entry. Without exception, returning astronauts marveled at Earth, the beautiful blue planet. By comparison with the Moon, magnificent, a symphony of color, movement, and life. But those heady days are long gone, and nobody has been back to the Moon. The last Apollo splashed down in the Pacific in 1972. America had proved its point and got the first man on the Moon. Not that the Soviets had ever admitted to a race. Apollo's leftovers were concentrated on Skylab, America's one and only Earth-orbiting space station. Astronauts and scientists spent over 500 days inside and outside this celestial laboratory. But the real experts at this were the Soviets. Crew after crew have manned a whole series of Salyut space stations, ferrying to and from orbit by the well-trusted Soyuz. The Soviets had proved that the human body can stand prolonged periods in space. The Salyut stations patrolled in lonely orbit for months, indeed years, while returning astronauts headed for home in Soyuz ferries that brought them down for parachute landing in Kazakhstan. The Soviets had perfected the Salyut program, and it continues today. But like Apollo and Skylab, it belongs to the expensive first age of space. This is the second. A new cost-conscious beginning when a space event would no longer be a special event. It was the early 1980s and the Americans had launched Space Shuttle. Shuttle went up like a rocket, she'd orbit like a spaceship, and she'd land like an aircraft. The all-in-one reusable space vehicle. And this was how she worked. At a couple of minutes from liftoff, the two spent booster rockets fell away. They would be recovered and used again on later missions, up to 25 times. The boosters gently parachuted into the Atlantic. At 9 minutes, the fuel tank jettisoned, receding like a giant tin can. Shuttle eased into orbit. It was beguiling stuff, not least for Gemini and Moon veteran John Young, who commanded the first shuttle flight on April the 12th, 1981. 20 years to the day since Gagarin's first flight. The massive cargo bay, big enough to accommodate the Soviet Union's entire Salyut space station, was what Shuttle was all about. With the payload doors open, the crew could deliver virtually anything to Earth orbit, or make a pickup. The true space ferry had arrived. Indeed, this picture was taken from a German satellite that Shuttle had freshly parked in orbit. There was a crew of 2, which could be increased to 5. Room as well for civilian specialists, even the occasional fare-paying passenger. Compared with the cramped conditions of earlier space vehicles, Shuttle was a luxury cruise ship with an onboard gymnasium. She was also a versatile workhorse. Scientifically, Shuttle was an experimenter's delight. In 1983, she carried America's first space woman, astrophysicist Sally Ride, here observing a storm on Earth. Shuttle was a satellite launcher. This spin was a stabilizing trick. When fired, the rocket at the bottom would thrust the satellite into an orbit 100 times higher than Shuttle's. In April 1984, the opening of a satellite repair service. This one, Solar Max, had malfunctioned since 1980. Its task had been to take special pictures of the sun to help unravel the mysteries of solar flares during a peak in their cycle. With Shuttle's work arm, Solar Max was grappled into the cargo bay. In just 45 minutes, the cosmic repairmen had replaced the attitude control module, which had caused the trouble. Aboard Shuttle, a job well done. From Mission Control, congratulations. As the work arm returned Solar Max to orbit, Shuttle had become what she claimed, an orbiting repair shop, and the astronomers had their satellite back. Shuttle has proved a qualified success. She's even gone commercial. The Europeans booked her to put up Space Lab, and the Americans to position an orbiting space telescope here in simulation, and to launch the Galileo spacecraft to probe the clouds of Jupiter. In the mid-80s, spacewalks became routine, but Shuttle and its astro engineers have had their problems. Launch delays, satellite malfunctions, and the rivalry of the unmanned Ariane program. Run by the European Space Agency, Ariane is thought by some to be a more reliable satellite launcher. And so, for home. The windows of Shuttle reflecting the red glow of re-entry. She's gliding now, her fuel entirely spent. In such temperatures, to have retained even a drop would cause a certain explosion. The craft is designed to be reused 100 times, but she's still a prototype, a fragile experimental vehicle subject to the vagaries of nature and the errors of man. On January the 28th, 1986, man's journey into space temporarily faltered.
Throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
One minute, 15 seconds.
7 astronauts died aboard Challenger, 1 minute and 14 seconds after liftoff.
We have no downlink.
3 weeks later, at midnight Moscow time, the Soviets launched the first stage of Mir, a vast permanently manned orbiting platform that could well be man's springboard to the planets and the third age of space.